Welcome to CP, CPK, PP, PPK, and Business Metrics, Insightful or Folly. I would like to welcome you all. Thank you for the time for joining us this afternoon. Wanted to address a couple of logistical issues before I introduce our presenter and speaker, Forrest Breyfogle. There's a lot of material planned for this one-hour webinar, so we've muted all audio. Please be sure to text in any questions you have during the session, and Forrest will be sure to answer in what time we have allowed at the end of the session. If any are unanswered, we will definitely get in touch with you via phone or email to answer any questions that aren't addressed during this session. So please be sure to submit those throughout. There will also be a recording. This will be available on our website within 48 hours, and you will receive an email with information to access this recording. As a participant in today's webinar, someone with Smarter Solutions will be giving you a call. If you do not wish to be contacted, please let us know in the feedback survey at the end of the webinar. I will now introduce Forrest Breyfogle. Forrest is a professional engineer, ASQ Fellow, and serves on the Board of Advisors for the University of Texas Center for Performance Excellence. In 2004, he received the Crosby Medal for his book, Implementing Six Sigma, Second Edition. Forrest has authored or co-authored 11 books and published over 100 technical articles for well-known worldwide publications. He's the founder and CEO of Smarter Solutions. He has recently completed publishing a 4-book series on integrated enterprise excellence that became available in 2008. Again, we'd like to
Thank you, Mallory. We're going to be covering a lot of ground today, and so I'm going to be putting the questions off until the end, and it actually might be a little bit over an hour. So I don't want to slow down some things. Six Sigma measurement systems analysis studies apply answer. Or if somebody else measures that part, they get a similar answer. However, let's look at processes. I think we would like to have the same type of behaviors or the results if we look at a process. However, if you have George going down and look at a process and trying to describe the performance of that process, he might present it as a pie chart. Now we could have Sue go down and look at the same process, and she might present it as a stacked bar chart. Now if we go in and compare what actions that pie chart and stacked bar chart could deliver, it could be very different actions. And so I'm suggesting that often our processes, or how we look at them, is somewhat of a measurement system analysis issue. Nobody seems to be talking about that, but I think it's a big issue. So that's basically the first bullet, and we'll be talking about that. Now, in the second bullet, if you're involved in Six Sigma, you'll be familiar with CP and CPK and PP and PPK. Those are process indices. Now, those also describe how the process is performing. We had Sue going in and like stacked bar charts. Well, if you were a Six Sigma zealot, you'd probably present it as a CP and CPK or PP and PPK. Now, but we don't often talk about how those particular metrics are very much of a function of how you sample from the process. And so we might have two different people looking at the same process and come out with very different results for these particular metrics depending upon how they happen to sample from that. So we're going to be talking about that also. Now the first two bullets describe issues with the way we currently look at systems or processes themselves and report their metrics. The third bullet really addresses a different way of viewing processes. So we're going to not only revisit those particular statements, but we're also going to be able to make predictive statements, because traditional metrics often just make statements about the past and make no reference to prediction. Hang on to your chair here. Now, there that's listed, it's a paper bag, 1,200 pages. Okay, before we begin, what I'd like to do is try to get an idea of where you're coming from. What's your role in life in your organization that you're involved with here? So I'd like for you to now go in and answer these questions that are in front of you here. Okay, looks like about 40% have voted here. Okay, let's give a couple more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we'll close the poll and let's see what we've got. Okay, what we have here is, let's see, we got about 39% for the developers, individual follow metrics 28, and so on. Okay, well, great. Well, thank you very much for your inputs to that. Okay, let's look at how we might view metrics. If we're evaluating the time it takes for us to go to work every day, I think we could expect that it's not going to be exactly the same time to the second. It's going to have some variability associated with that. And why do we have this variability? Well, it could be different traffic conditions or the stoplights, or maybe we left a little bit later today and got more traffic than yesterday and so on. And more often than not, it's common cause variability. So it's going to have some up and down measurements over time, and that's what we're presenting as this control chart. And you can see the red lines there represent one way of viewing if we have an unusual event, a special cause, as we say. Maybe there was an accident along the way, and it took us half an hour longer to arrive or take in our commute to work. And so we can separate common cause and special cause variability using the control chart there. Now, if we go in and view data this way, and we've got a recent region of stability, we can go in and create a histogram and then maybe create a probability density function or Gaussian curve that kind of describes how much variability we get or we could expect to get. Okay, and that's shown on the right-hand side, where now we're looking at the over here. Now, it depends upon how we're actually measuring. If we're looking at a clock, we may not be do as well as if we had a stopwatch. On the left-hand side, we see that there's a true value, short-term, long-term variability. These are all true sources of variability. Now, if we look on the right-hand side of the tree, we notice that there's a measurement error, and it's got bias. Maybe, gee whiz, our stopwatch or our particular wristwatch that we're looking at runs faster than it should. So that would be maybe a bias associated with it, and there could be a certain amount of stability associated with the measurement system. Now, if you notice, there's also gauge R&R. That's repeatability and reproducibility. Now, repeatability is, does someone that looks at a particular event, if they could go back in time and look at it again, would they get the same number? Okay, now, you could have the same event or a particular part that you're measuring. Does somebody else get the same value that that person did? And that's repeatability. So these are sources of the measurement error that you have. Okay, now, if we go in and look at the overall business itself, now the business at a high level is really trying to achieve what he called 3 R's of business. That is, everybody doing the right things and doing them right at the right time. So those things should be embraced by an organization. And we would like to have a system that encourages that. Now, one way of looking at how well we're actually doing that is performance metrics objectives. So we want to have measurements that help us go in and achieve the 3 R's of business. Now, if we look at it relative to a performance need, we want to go in and have measurements that lead to the most appropriate action or non-action. And we'd like to make it so it's independent of the person compiling the information. Okay, now, you might have Sam going in and looking at it and creating a pie chart, and Sue looking at the same process, creating a stacked bar chart. Now, you would like to have it so that they're actually looking at the data so that they create the same action or non-action. But if you look at different presentation styles, you can actually affect the behaviors because there's different ways of interpreting it. And I'm suggesting that's a gauge R&R problem, just like I talked about in the previous slide. Now, the basic right behavior objective is not unlike the inspection gauge for measurement system analysis. We want to make sure when somebody's looking at a measurement, that's not unlike an inspector, we can determine whether the component is good or bad, or whether we should be taking an action or a non-action. That's what it's really about. Now, if we go in and look at how we present data, we could have tabular reporting, we could have stacked bar charts, we could have the balanced scorecard. But what I'm suggesting is if we take a given process and present it again in these different ways, we can have very different opinions on what the appropriate action or non-action is. And just to reiterate, I think that's a measurement system analysis problem. Okay, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to elaborate more on the magnitude of this measurement system analysis issue relative to the CP, CPK, PP, and PPK process capability indices focus, because CP, these process capability indices are really quantification or assessment of how a process are doing. That's what they're really about. And then what I'm going to describe is a different system, a different way that you can go in and look at the overall system itself, because traditional metrics, whether it's a stack bar chart, pie chart, or whatever, or even CP and CPK, these are metrics that come from the past. They are not presented in a fashion that they're making a projection of the future. That's not the way people typically present them. But what I'm going to be doing is presenting another way of looking at these particular data sets so that we can look at predictive measurements. This is not unlike driving a car. If you just look at the past data, like the stack bar charts and so on, it's not unlike driving a car looking at the rearview mirror. However, what I want to have is a metric system that looks out the windshield, and if you don't like what you see, then you need to make some adjustments with the steering wheel or brakes or whatever, so you move in the right direction relative to any hazards that you might see. Okay, now just for definition, so we basically all understand what process capability indices are, we're going to first talk about the CP. CP represents allowable tolerance interval spread in relation to the actual spread of the data when the data follows a normal distribution. Now, what does that look like mathematically? Well, you're taking the upper spec limit minus the lower spec limit. So this is basically the tolerance divided by 6 times the standard deviation. So for this particular metrics, one thing, we have to have a tolerance. So if you don't have a tolerance, this metric doesn't even really apply. But we're going to consider for right now that we do have a tolerance. So you can see we're comparing as a ratio the spread of the tolerance relative to the spread of the data, or 6 times the standard deviation. Now, CP addresses only the spread of the process relative to the tolerance, but it does not address how it's centered relative to the tolerance. That is, how the process is centered relative to the overall tolerance. And that's what CPK does. So CPK is looking at the minimum of those different quantities. So if a process is exactly centered, then the CP and CPK value would be exactly the same. But CPK addresses any shift that you have of your process relative to the centering of the overall tolerance spread. Now notice we have that term in the equation, standard deviation. Now the question is, how do you calculate standard deviation? And that's what I'm going to be referencing in a couple slides. Now, process capability, or CP and CPK, is typically viewed as short-term variability assessment. Now, there's another indices or pair of indices that's called PP and PPK. These are sometimes referred to as long-term capability or performance indices. Now, mathematically, the relationship between PP and PPK is exactly the same thing as CP and CPK. And this is the relationship. We get upper spec limits minus lower spec limits divided by 6 times the standard deviation. Now, in this case, standard deviation is considered to be long-term. Okay, how you magically calculate that, I'm going to be getting to that. Now, similarly, we have PPK, where now we're going to be calculating this relative to how the data is spread relative to the centering of the overall distribution. Now you can see the relationships on CP and CPK and PP and PPK are mathematically exact, but the difference comes in on how you calculate standard deviation. Now, in order to expand upon that, we have to look at how you would go in and potentially capture data that you're going to be analyzed. So one situation, I'll call situation 1, is looking at data using an X bar and R control chart, where you have subgroups of sample size, for example, 5. So in this case, for every tick mark on the x-axis, we call that a subgroup. And for every tick mark, we would have 5 particular readings. And we look at the average of those readings, and we look at the range. We basically have 2 different charts. So for each subgroup, again, for the X bar and R chart, we have a particular number that's greater than 1. Now, we could also sample from a process where we have only 1 measurement per subgroup, and that's called an individuals chart or an X chart. It's just somebody could choose an X bar and R chart, another person could choose an individuals chart out of the same process when they're evaluating it. Now, a third situation is a random sample of measurements from a population. So in situation 1 and 2, we've got a time series event. But if you have a warehouse and you're just sampling from a warehouse or sampling from transactions that were completed in one day and they're not time series, we could consider we have a random sample of measurements from a population where maybe the population is 1 day, or it could be 1 week or 1 year for that matter when we're looking at it. Now, the question is, how would you calculate standard deviation? Because that's the key here. Now, in this table, you'll notice across the top I got X chart, X bar and R chart, and I got random sample. So those are the 3 different methodologies that I talked about earlier here, situation 1, 2, and 3. On the left-hand side, you'll see CP and CPK, and also PP and PPK. So we're going to look at how we calculate CP and CPK from an individual's chart to determine standard deviation. Now, for an individual's chart, you can only have 1 sample per subgroup. So the way you calculate standard deviation is you look at the differences between every adjacent subgroup, and you look at the range, and that's called, if you look at the overall range, we'll call that the moving range, between sample 1 and sample 2, you look at the difference there, and then between 2 and 3, and so on. You average all those differences, and that's how you get that MR bar, or moving range average. And then that's divided by D2. It's a constant, because in this particular case, you got a sample size of 2. You're looking at a range between two adjacent values. But what's key here is that variability is calculated as the variability between subgroups. I just want to reiterate that. The variability for standard deviation on an individual's chart is between subgroups. Okay, now let's look at an X bar and R chart. An X bar and R chart for each subgroup will have maybe 5 or 6 samples per subgroup. And those will each, for each subgroup, have a range, the highest to lowest value. And then what we're going to do is average all those ranges for the 30 subgroups that we have or so on. So we get an average range. And then we divide it by D2. Now D2 is just a constant dependent upon how many is in the subgroup. So if you have 3 in the subgroup, that would be one number. If you have 5, it would be a different number. So don't worry about that number. That's just a constant. But the key point here is, where does variability come from? It's the variability within subgroups. That's very different than the individuals chart, and that's a key point here. Now for CP and CPK, relative to random sample, we don't have sequencing. We don't have any sequence when we go in and look at day sales outstanding that we had for last year. We just randomly pick some. We don't have a sequencing on that if we're just picking a random sample. So it's not applicable because, again, CP and CPK are short-term variability, so it's looking at the sequencing, or sequencing is a very important part of that calculation. Okay, now PP and PPK is dealing with long-term variability. And you see that that relationship is pretty similar across the board. Okay, so if we go on now, and let's look at the implication of this set of numbers or set of equations for a particular data set. And this is taken from one of my books here on volume 3. So for each subgroup, in this case, we have 5 samples. Okay. Now, if somebody's doing an X bar and R chart, they would plot the average value for each of those subgroups and the range value also. So you have 2 charts over time. And we'll look at that and how you get standard deviation and so on. But somebody could just pick only one sample. Again, this is from the same in the upper right-hand corner here. And I'm going to start talking about it here a little bit for each of these. We would like to have it so on CP and CPK, we get a similar number. For the individuals chart, again, they could pick only one sample per subgroup. So the variability is between subgroups now, and it turns out 4.26. Okay? Now let's look at what you would get if somebody were to do an X bar and R chart. Okay, you would have R bar divided by D2, since D2 at 2.326 is because we had 5 samples per subgroup, and you get a 0.9 value. Wow. Compare 4.26 to 0.9. Okay, what that implication is, you could get very different numbers for comparing CP and CPK relative to if someone were to sample from using an individuals chart or an X bar and R chart. And I'm suggesting that's a gauge R&R problem. To illustrate the magnitude of those particular numbers, for the subgroups of 5 versus 1, let's look at the difference between, for CP, if you had 5 samples or if you had 1 sample. Boy, what a big difference there. The CP of 1.82 doesn't look too bad if you had 5 samples, but if you had 1 sample, it's 0.39. Let's look at CPK. Oh my goodness, 1.44 compared to 0.29. Just think about the implication of this. If your supplier was doing 5 samples per subgroup, they would look real good. If they were only looking at 1 sample per subgroup, it doesn't look so good. So that to me is a major problem that's often not talked about in CP and CPK and PP and PPK terminologies. Now you don't see as much differences on comparing the PP and PPK because the X bar and R chart versus the individuals chart, the standard deviation calculation is very different if you're doing an individuals chart or an X bar and R chart. Remember, X bar and R chart is within variability, subgroup variability, and individuals between subgroup variability, and that's the means for the differences, or that's the reason for the differences. Now, there's some other conceptual MSA issues with the process capability reporting. Also, if you have normality issues, in other words, things are not normal, you can normally distribute it, you can have some problems. Also, physically, what does it really mean? When somebody reports these process capability indices, can we really understand what it means? Does everybody react to the numbers in the same fashion? I think that's not always the case. Now, the third bullet talks about something I think is a really important issue that is often not addressed. Whenever you're making a process capability statement, you need to make sure that you're making a statement where the process is stable. Let's consider over the last year you had a change that was in June, and somebody decided, well, I'm going to look at the process capability for last year. Well, that's really not the right thing to do because your process changed in June, so you had a process capability after or the last part of the year that was different than the first part of the year. So you need to make two different statements. So whenever you're presenting process capability statements or making a statement of how the process is doing, you need to first identify if the process is stable. And it might have been stable for the last 3 weeks, 3 months, or 3 years, and you need to include that in the assessment. Also, process capability indices don't really provide a predictive performance statement by themselves. Now, just getting back to our reporting system, CP and CPK is one way of presenting how a process is doing, but also if we're looking at the overall business, we can have tabular reporting, stack bar charts, the balanced scorecard. So there's other different ways of presenting it that amplify this issue. And again, all these are pretty much looking at driving a car by only looking out the rearview mirror. Now, let's start consider how typical measurements are viewed. They're often looked at fiscally, they're unrelated to process improvement, and often they make only point-to-point comparisons. If we're, in general, looking at process statements, we need to understand and get this in our heart that Y is a function of X. That is, the output of a process is a function of what we do within the process, that's the process steps, and also the inputs to the process. If we don't like the output of the process, we need to go in and change either the inputs or the process itself. Now, what I'm suggesting is we really want to have measurements that lead to the right kind of behaviors. That is the 3 R's of business. Everybody doing the right things, doing it right at the right time. Now, how do we do that? Well, I'm suggesting we view the enterprise as a system of process. So we have metrics that actually do that. And that really is not happening often with table numbers and so on. We want to view metrics as a result of these processes. We acknowledge effective variability. If we're just looking at a table number or a red, yellow, green scorecard and say, did this number meet the goal today, we're not really going in and looking at and understanding variability as part of that process. And also we want to systematically look at change relative to how metrics are actually getting reported. So if we, in other words, we don't like the number, we're going to have to do something fundamentally change. If you just go in and set goals for Y without having a measurement system to actually make improvements to meet those Y goals, I call that. Now, if we go in and look at Y as a function of X again, what we want to do when we're dealing with is if the property, the downtime was large, and it was because of an electrical storm. Okay, now, are we going to go in because of that electrical storm, make a change to our system so the next time there's an electrical storm we don't have this same kind of outage? Or is it truly an unusual event that is not a real big issue? In other words, there's a particular part that we're manufacturing, all of a sudden something unusual happened, but it's still well within specification. So it's unusual, but we really didn't need to take corrective action because it was still okay. So that basically talks about the options that you have with step number 1. Now, step number 2, is the process stable and meeting internal and external customer needs? If so, no action is required. So the idea is we look at the big picture and say, gee whiz, this metric is not really the bottleneck of the overall organization. And relative to process improvement, we're going to focus on another area of the business. So let's don't make it worse. So as long as it's not worse, then we don't have to do anything. Number 3, if the process is stable but does not meet internal or external customer needs. If so, process improvement efforts are needed. So now we're working on process improvements. That is, the X's are the process itself to make improvements so that the Y in time is better. Okay, let's look at this. One thing that's really important to understand is data from region of stability can be used to estimate the nonconformance rate of a process during these time frames. So first off, what we have to do is we have to establish, using what I call 30,000-foot level charting, determine the stable regions of a process. And once we establish those regions of stability, we can then go in and make a statement of how the process is performing. Remember, I want to get the 2 people, I don't remember their names now, Sue and Sam, to actually look at that particular process such that we're looking out the windshield of the car as opposed to the rear view mirror. Now, if you have a recent region of stability, and that could be 3 days, 3 months, or 3 years, well, we can look at that particular data from that recent region of stability and consider it to be a random sample of the future. What's the implication of this? We can start looking at the windshield of the car. Now, if when we're looking out the windshield of the car, we see something, well, first I'm going to talk about on this slide continuous response, and then on the next slide I'll talk about attribute response. So first, we want to go in and determine if there's a region of stability. Now, in this case, there is 2 regions of stability. It was identified as before change and then after the change. Now, I contend if we talk about using process capability indices, often people do not understand what we're talking about. So I like to present it in terms that everybody understands. Now, one way to view that is using a probability plot. This is one of the tools I think that's very much underutilized. Notice at the top, their word is written as normal. So I can have it handle a normal distribution, or I can have it handle a log normal distribution. That's no big deal here. So if the data does not follow a straight line, we're suggesting that distribution does not fit very well, and you might need to do a transformation such as a log normal transformation. And it's really important to address this issue of normality within the overall assessment of how the process is doing relative to stability and also making process performance statements. So if we look at before the change, that's the red line here. In this particular case, we got a specification of 100 plus or minus 4. If you look at on the x-axis on that probability plot, you notice it goes to 96 and 104. So that's 100 plus or minus 4. Now, before the change, the process was stable with an approximate nonconformance rate of 9.2%. So can you see how I got that? If we look on the red plot on the right-hand side, we look at the cumulative percentage. You see 91.002. So we look at the difference between 100 and 91. We get about 9, right? Now, if you look on the low side of the spec, that's 96. You notice that's about 2.2%. So if you had 9.2%, you see you got 9.2%. So that's before the change, 9.2%. And after the change, you get about 0%. Now notice with this approach, it's real easy to understand what we have, and everybody pretty much understands it. Before we made the change, we had about 9.2%, and we could maybe look at how much that's costing the business. And after the change, we did a lot better and made a dramatic savings to the overall business. Now, this particular type of charting is what I call 30,000 foot level control charting on the left-hand side. It's very different than traditional control charting, where the primary objective of traditional control chart is to identify when a special cause occurs, it's an unusual event, stop the presses and fix the problem. This is not that. I'm taking a 30,000 foot level view, that is like a view from an airplane. I'm looking at from the overall output of the process. So if you got differences between departments for this particular process, or difference between raw material lots, or temperatures of the machines, or settings on the machines, or operators, and so on, that's considered a source of common cause variability. And what we would look at is that as an individual's chart. Now, there's a certain amount of training that needs to go to put together these charts, because it is a little different to how to create those charts. So if you're interested in that, let us know. So at this is the way I like a presentation. I'm going to be always talking about the box at the bottom and not get into all the gory details of how to create the charts up at the top. So this particular chart is for continuous data. Now I'm going to talk about attribute data. Okay, on attribute data, we don't really include a probability plot. In this particular case, we had a before the change and after the change. Here you could, if you got equivalent subgroup sizes, you could look at the y-axis. So this had a subgroup size of 1,000. Before the change, the stable process was approximately 5% nonconformance rate, and after the change, about 2% nonconformance rate. Now, this particular type of methodology for its reporting could be used for Lean Six Sigma projects. So you could look at how long does it take to get through a process, or the defective rates, and so on. And you want to go in and do a project that's actually going to improve those metrics. But we like to go in and also take it to the business level, too. So we're going to be talking about that. And when we do that, we would like to look at this SBPC system to track interconnection of the business process map functions, and an alternative forward-looking dashboard, like we've talked about on these particular charting systems that are predictive, and we want to go in and look at that relative to the overall business system on how we look at metrics in generals. And then when we take this overall business system for looking at metrics, then we can blend it with how we're creating strategies so it leads to the right and most appropriate activities within the organization as a whole. So the organization as a whole benefit, and we get away from siloed improvement projects that don't really benefit the business as a whole. Now, we're going to be kind of changing gears here. We talked about some of the issues relative to CP and CPK and other particular ways of looking at the data. We also talked about this predictive scorecard system. And now we're going to look at how we're going to align this overall business scene. And now I want you to go in and all of a sudden magically take the role of the CEO or president of your organization. Now, if you put yourself in their particular situation, the navigating in a way, a roadmap to help through that, create a framework for healthy policy creation and deployment. Also gives you, as we've been talking about, predictive measurements. And also another benefit is that we can now integrate scorecards with strategic planning, business improvement, and control, so the enterprise as a whole benefits. And this goes beyond Lean Six Sigma's project-based system. It's applicable to both large and small organizations, for-profit, non-profit, and also it's not saying that you have to do all this tomorrow. I'm suggesting it's better to start small and grow bigger over time. This 9-step system is basically a business system. Often organizations lead from strategies, and I think strategy is important, but if you notice in this 9-step process, strategies are step 5. I think it's really important to create a long-lasting front end. So even though strategies change, our system does not change overall. If you're a hospital, you don't build bridges. So fundamentally, you do the same thing all the time, independent of the strategy that you have from a day-to-day operation point of view. So now, step number 1 and 2 actually create that environment, that long-lasting environment. So your vision and mission and who you are don't fundamentally change over time. Number 2 is describe your value chain, including what I call a satellite and 30,000-foot level metric. Now, we talked about satellite level metrics as being operational metrics, and they're predictive. Now, satellite are similar, but they're only dealing with financial metrics. Now, the value chain also includes what you do. If you're a hospital, you got certain functions that you do. And the satellite and 30,000-foot level measurements are looking at how well you actually perform those functions. Now, it needs to be highlighted here that the organization chart is actually subordinate to the value chain. So in other words, you reorganize, it doesn't mess up all your metrics. So you're having and creating long-lasting metrics that are not going to change with leadership change or organizational changes. Now, in the overall business system, we know we need to improve. You know, it's a way of life. But where do you improve? You can't improve everything. It's because Y is a function X. That means for everything that you have, that you set a goal, you have to do changes the X's or the process itself. Now, if you look at every process you have, it would be ludicrous to say you have to improve everything, or you couldn't do it. It's too much effort. So we want to figure out where we should focus our efforts so the business as a whole benefits. So we need to analyze the enterprise collectively. And then what we want to create smart satellite level goals. Those are financial goals. And relative to financial goals or the business, I'm looking at revenue growth and profit margins. So somebody asked a question here earlier relative to how to measure the business, ROI versus ROA. I'm suggesting here from a business point of view, we're looking at how much money do we get to keep percentage-wise, and also how does the business grow. From a high-level point of view, I think that's what we ought to look at the business, fundamentally. Okay, now after we've got those financial goals and tracking those over time, again, it's not bounded by calendar year on 30,000 and satellite level metrics. You know, it could be 4 years of the most recent region of stability, so that's fine. Then we want to create strategies, and we're not pulling it out of the air. We're creating them so that it's consistent with the business we're in, and we're not pie in the sky and so on. And then we want to get into identification of projects 6 and 7, and then we execute those projects and maintain the gain. Now, it's important to go in and notice we loop back to step number 3. So I've covered a lot of ground on this slide here, and again, we have a 4-hour webinar that goes into more details if you're interested. Now, I want to focus on step number 2 because that's one piece of what we've really been covering here is the metrics portion. The value chain. What does the value chain look? Again, as I mentioned earlier, the value chain is basically the functions that you perform and how you're measuring those functions. So the rectangular boxes here look at what we do. If you notice the shaded boxes there, you can drill down on those, and so these are an HTML type text, so you can click on those to find out what the procedure you're doing. The oblong boxes are how well you're measuring those, or not how well, but what you're actually measuring. So if we look at produce and deliver a product, we're talking about defective rate, lead times, on-time delivery, and so on. And what we want to do is track those using our 30,000-foot level metrics like we just described in this particular section. And we want to look, is it predictable, and then what do you predict? Non-conformance rate or whatever. And again, we're going to be having next week a 6-hour session on how to create these metrics for all sorts of different situations. Now, if we go in and look at the mechanics of actually pulling all this together relative to the 9 steps, I created something that's different. It's called an enterprise to make system. Now, this should not be confused with a project to make system. Very different. In this, we're looking at the overall business, where we're defining the business, measuring the business, then we're analyzing the business, improving, controlling it. So when we define the business, one piece of it is our procedures. And the second piece in the value chain shown on the left-hand side there, the bottom left, is that's how we measure it. So define and measure is the long-lasting piece of the story here for the business. Then we want to analyze it. We're looking at the bottlenecks that we have shown in the upper right-hand corner. We're also looking at risks. In the lower right-hand corner, we're going to get to enterprise improvement plan to get the projects that we think could make a difference. Okay. Notice here, and that's on the lower right-hand corner is when we really get into step 5 of that 9-step process where we're creating the strategies. Okay, and it's getting the project. Now the question is, how do you execute the projects? Okay, the projects are really from the enterprise to make system, they're off of the improve phase. So if we're doing a process improvement project, we follow the project. So what we're suggesting is the 30,000-foot level metrics, like I'm described here, would be how you would baseline your projects, and that's what you want to look at and make your assessments on how well you did in your improvement. And the problems we've had today. Now, I understand I've covered a lot of ground here in the last session, particularly, and we're covering more elaboration on the metrics again in a 6-hour webinar that's next week, and then in January we've got another one on this overall IEE system, which is a 4-hour one. But hopefully we whet your appetite here a little bit for looking at this more. Now, how does this overall system compare to other systems? Suggesting here the Integrated Enterprise Excellence does a much better job of addressing all the attributes of what we think is important to the overall business system relative to even what's done in the MBA program. We've had people go through the Master Black Belt training at the same time they're going through the MBA program and say, man, this ought to be taught in their MBA schools, and we don't disagree with that. Traditional Six Sigma, they work primarily on projects. Execution is not a business system. And also the balanced scorecard we think's got some shortcomings. So just to kind of net out what we covered, again, we've given you maybe a little bit of fire hose here. We've talked, first off, illustrated how Lean and Six Sigma measurement system analysis studies apply to performance metrics. So again, I was talking about going to work, how long it takes you to get to work. If you start having differences or measurement with a stopwatch versus your wristwatch, you have some different issues with that. Or also how you went in and looked at scorecards. If you had pie charts versus stacked bar charts, you can get very different stories, and I'm suggesting that's a measurement system issue. Then I highlighted issues you had with process capability issues, that somebody looking at a particular process, they can get a very different number depending upon how they sample from the process. In particular, if you recall, the CP and CPK value relative to how somebody did an X bar and R chart or an individual chart to calculate those numbers. Thirdly, I went in and provided a measurement system that was a little different. It looks out the windshield, and it created a predictive measurement system. And it also presented it in terms that everybody would understand nonconformance rates as opposed to other indices or something else that may be hard for people to understand. And with this, so that the organization as a whole benefit. We've got a lot of free articles download from our website on our resource center. Also, we're offering also kind of a discount for the book set here. If you're interested in that, so you get a 40% off. Notice there's a coupon code there on the right-hand side and lower right-hand side. So if you're interested in that, write that down and then take advantage of this particular discount. Okay, we're ready for questions and answers here. Let's see, I think we got some questions over here Mallory has put together here. There are quite a few of them here. Okay, we got one talking about the footnote implies, slide 18, footnote implies that the pooled standard deviation removes unbiased. How does pooling remove the bias? I'd suggest you go in and, well, it's covered in my book. It's just a different equation, and I don't really think that this is the time to elaborate on that. I do cover that more in the book, and if you want to cover something offline on that, and also Minitab, for example, gets into some of the details on that. What you suggested in for PP and PPK calculations, well, what I'm suggesting is that you really don't use PP and PPK calculations because, you know, there what you kind of take what you get. You know, I'm looking at, instead of PP and PPK calculations, that you're looking at and presenting it in the percentage of nonconformance. So if you're familiar and you got a continuous response and you're used to looking at Minitab's process capability report out, you're basically, it's the lower right-hand number where it's parts per million and it's long-term. That's the number that you look at, and you can convert that to percentage. And that's the number I'm suggesting reporting out instead of doing PP and PPK calculation. Now, you know, relative to the confusion of PP and PPK is that people don't often realize if you got a two-sided spec, you have to go in and report both PP and PPK. So we're trying to make a determination about this process, and now you got two numbers. So it's there's a lot of confusion on that, and I talk about that in 3 also. Okay, we're over the time. We're just about 1 hour here. So like I said, the questions will I'll be addressing these questions and try to get through most of them here. So if you can hang in there, that'd be great. If not, I understand. So let's see. Somebody had a question here. Slide 22. Any process capability assessments of an unstable process is improper. What does improper mean? How is it assessed? Okay, from process, first off, an unstable process. If you go in and look at charting your control charts, that identifies if you've got an unstable process. Now, there's some processes, by the nature of it, will be unstable, and you can't do a darn thing about it. And third shift is different. If you do it by shift, it's going shift 1, 2, and then blip on shift 3. That is a common cause variability. It kind of goes away because, and it also gets you out of autocorrelation problems. In other words, today's this data point is correlated to previous measurement. Now, let's say, for example, we're looking at the call center. Okay, we're probably going to get differences on hold times depending upon day of the week. So we'd subgroup by week. So when we subgroup by week, the differences between day of the week don't appear as common cause variability. And I'm also going to look at those as an individuals chart as opposed to an X bar and R chart. And in Volume 3, I go through the details on why that's true, because 30,000-foot level metrics, X bar and R charts has some issues, and I talk about that in Volume 3. So we want to have the variability between subgroups be a very key important part of determining if a process is stable. Okay, so that's kind of what I mean. And a lot of times when you start looking at processes this way, you'll notice that they are stable. If you looked at them a different way, then they're not viewed as stable. So again, I elaborate more of that on Volume 3. Shouldn't PP formula have N, not N minus 1, in denominator, since it represents the population? No, the usual way is that you consider N minus 1, but that's an interesting point. Okay, sometimes when you have all the data in a process, we'll actually still consider that's a sample of the process, even if you have all the data. So in other words, if you could go back in time, you'd probably get a different number. And so often, even though we're going in and looking at a process, we'll consider it to be a sampling of the process, even if we have all the data itself. So, but that's a kind of a side point there, but it's somewhat related to that question. Okay, on page 25, isn't the first option really true? Process stable, but meeting customer specs, and B, not meeting customer specs. That's kind of one way of looking at it. You know, if you remember what option 1 was, the process is unstable and meeting I'm saying whether it's an issue or not, and in meeting customer specifications or not. So I'm trying to make it a little more general than that. Page 27, why if both processes are stable is one predictable? If a process changed, let's say June of looking at the latest region of stability, because I'm talking about the future. Last June has gone by. That's in that region, it's stable there, and for that region, I guess we could say it's predictable for that region. But I'm talking about predicting from the future as in future today. So I'm looking at, is the process stable now? And if it is, I'm talking about making a prediction in the future of what it is from today. So I think that that's what the point, hopefully that answers the question. Okay, the question is, somebody asked, why did I calculate of 9.2 as non-conformance? So I have to go, in order to answer that one, I got to go back to this chart here. Okay, if you look, that question is dealing with the red line. Okay, if on the y-axis it's percentage less than, so that's like a distribution that we could draw. Let's see. This is, I don't know. I'm going to try to do it with this. I don't know if this is, oops. No, it doesn't seem to work. Okay, let's see. I think you see my mouse here. This is like a, oops, didn't want to do that. Okay, this would be like a distribution here. This is a distribution here. So what we're looking at here is this is 1% less than on that distribution. This is 50%, and this is 99%. So if we come out 104, follow this up here, and over here we see a value of 91%. So 91 subtracted from 100, that's 9%, the difference between there and there. So let's remember that number. Now we go on the other side of the tolerance, 96. And we're looking at the percentage less than there is that's about 0.2, right? So we're going to add 9 plus 0.2. Whoops. What happened there? Oh, there we go. Notice here, then I get 9.2 in the box at the bottom there. So that's how I got 9.2. So it's a percentage less than the distribution that we'd have, and then also the other onto the right-hand side, which is 9%. So hopefully it answers your question here. Okay, let's see. We got another. I am doing a Lean Six Sigma implementation in a small nonprofit organization. They do not have any standards in place, so before I do anything, I'm taking them with a 5S first, then we will map the value stream. Is this correct? If not, why? Yeah. That's not the way I'd approach it, okay? What I'd approach it is, because the 5S was, for those that may not be familiar, it's basically housekeeping. You're trying to clean up everything system. You have to, there's more of this 9-step process. We basically rough out this overall system. To better understand this, I try to build an analogy of refinishing a piece of furniture. We can go in and polish a handle. That may be a 5S. Okay, we can sand the leg. That's a Lean Six Sigma project. We can sand the other, another leg on the left-hand side. That's maybe a TQM project. We can do all these projects, but the furniture still doesn't look very good. So what you want to go in and do is start roughing out the overall system. And I'm suggesting you want to build this overall system. We can start out in a week. Is it going to be perfect? No, but you basically rough the overall system by looking at 60 grit sandpaper. And then you continually refine it. And then what you want to do is have the system lead you to the projects that are important to you. And so when you analyze it, the overall system in the lower right-hand corner, you want to get the projects that impact the business as a whole. And you want to establish goals eventually for people that own those particular metrics, and they need to go in and prove it. And that's their why, and that needs to get changed. And now we're going to go in and figure out what X's or process improvements we have to make, and that becomes a Lean Six Sigma project. Or it could be 5S for that matter, too. But it's important there, looking at the upper right-hand corner, to go in and focus on identifying the constraint of the organization. Often we have people working in manufacturing. I was a guest speaker at a company, that they're doing their Lean Six Sigma, and I heard lean, lean, lean. This was by the general manager of the plant, and so I toured the facility. They're doing a lot of good things, but I noticed there's a lot of idle equipment. And I said, gee whiz, it seems like you could handle a lot more production. They said, oh, yeah, we could do that. I said, what are you doing in sales and marketing? Because that's obviously your bottleneck. And the face went blank, as in nothing. So to me, that's a really important issue because you can have problems if you don't do that. And if you start looking at a lot of companies had some financial problems, who did they get rid of first? A lot of people that were doing their process improvement projects. Another question, long-term is real capability. Short-term measures are nonsense. I will not disagree with that. A serious variance components characteristics is required before any sampling plan is developed for capability metrics. Right. I'm suggesting that you can do that, but the problem you can have there is, are you looking over the right period of time? Because the variance components can give you an awful lot of indicators and so on. The variance components can gain you a lot of insight to where the problems is happening. So I'm not against variance components, but I'm mixed up in the mix. It's kind of like apples and oranges and peaches are all mixed up together. And at the high level, 30,000-foot level, I'm not even interested in that. Because if at a 30,000-foot level I don't have a problem, I don't want to work in that area. And also I'm trying to go in and create a business system that can be, and variance components is just a snapshot of what happens in this period of time frame. So anyway, I think we've got, I've got a couple more questions here. Maybe we'll go in and answer those offline here a little bit. And so I really thank you for your participation here. And where am I at here? So once you exit the webinar, a survey will appear. And again, we appreciate your feedback and also the time that you spent with us this afternoon. So thank you very much and hope to hear from you soon.